Good morning. Thank you for having me. I have to say this is a very different venue from where I've given this talk before. The last time was at the Art Biennale in Venice about 10 days ago. Albert asked me to talk about the moral and ethical challenges of climate change and the critical importance of how we behave in the next 10 or 15 years for the future really of all humanity on Earth. For a little bit of background, I'm an ecologist and an oceanographer, and in my short career of really only about 50 years, I have watched every ecosystem I ever studied either entirely disappear or be degraded almost beyond recognition, and it sort of sharpens the mind. And it transformed me from being a purely academic scientist fascinated by things that 10 people in the world care about, to feeling that it was really a mission for me and for my kids and my grandkids to engage in what I think is a truly existential crisis, and a crisis which is greater than anything that humanity has ever faced before, because it is a challenge that could utterly destroy civilization as we know it and the way we live. Now, before you get too depressed, the good news is that we actually know what to do. And we not only do we know what to do, but we know how to do it. And we have the technology already to do most of the things we need to do. And really, the only thing that holds us back is greed and envy and all the rest. What keeps me up at night, and I mean up at night because I do it all the time, is the question as to whether or not we in America, because we are the biggest show in town, whether we as Americans will have the collective willpower and wisdom to wake up and act in our own best interests, or whether we're just going to sit back and watch everything goes to hell. I had the privilege and the honor of being an observer at the Papal Academy meetings about climate change and environmental degradation that were held at the Vatican in 2014. They were a major initiative by Pope Francis, the first major initiative of his papacy. And although he didn't come to all our talks, he showed up and we all chatted, and his passion about that was amazing. That meeting and a second that followed a few months later was a who's who assemblage of the world's absolutely greatest climate scientists, environmental economists, ecologists, philosophers, you name it. And the outcome of those meetings became the basis for Pope Francis's first major 2015 encyclical, Laudato Si, on the care and stewardship of creation, in which the Pope deeply criticizes consumerism and irresponsible development and laments environmental degradation and climate change. The encyclical actually builds on the early Jewish concept of tikkun olam, that in the modern sense is the idea that all Jews, and by extension all Christians, bear responsibility not only for their own moral, spiritual, and material welfare, but also for the welfare of society at large. Laudato Si is a deeply moving and meaningful call to the people of the world to take swift and unified action. Every thinking person, regardless of faith, should read and digest it carefully and read it again. It is a truly amazing and revolutionary document in our civilization. Now, 1 year later, it seemed like everything was going to be terrific. We had the Paris Climate Accords. Virtually every nation in the world signed on. We really thought that things were really going to happen. But while much real progress has been made, even in this country, even today in this country with the boss we have, Washington fiddles while the nation and the world burns. And you just have to ask the question, I ask the question as a scientist who knows this stuff, how can we as a nation be so profoundly stupid as the way we are right now? Because we are truly stupid. And make no mistake, climate change is real, and it's real today, not some imaginary thing in the future. The science of climate change is absolutely stellar. Denial is nothing more but a cynical endgame strategy by the fossil fuel industry to pump as much as possible out of the ground before it becomes against the law to do that. Even Norway, an oil-producing country, is slowing down in its oil production. And don't get me wrong, it's not just radicals like me. Smart people really get it. Both Democrats and Republicans, hyper-successful businessmen like James Baker, who was Papa Bush's Secretary of State, Michael Bloomberg, Warren Buffett, are all climate change believers, are all people who manipulate their investments in a kind of way that begins more and more to recognize this. And even the big oil people get it. We know that ExxonMobil has known for over 30 years the effects of climate change. We know they have deliberately worked to make people believe it's not true. And it's why they're so scared and why they're lying. Now, you know, I've spent, so you don't think I'm just some sort of crazy environmentalist, I've had the honor of being invited to attend meetings at the Naval War College for more than 15 years. And you know, the military services, they're not environmental NGOs. They're the people whose job it is to protect us. And they take climate change really, really seriously. The first time I went was a 2-day meeting about environmental risk. And during that meeting, we discussed candidly and in detail the looming destruction of many coastal American cities by hurricanes and sea level rise. These are crises the Navy has to respond to. They have to rescue people. They have to do everything to try and get us out of the jam. And they're deeply concerned about that, but they're also really deeply concerned as a military force about the effects of climate change on famine, mass migration, warfare, national and international security. We would talk openly about the fact that the troubles and wars of the Middle East are a function of climate change, that starvation is driving the mass migrations in the Middle East. At that meeting, I was asked to do something that made me incredibly nervous, and that was to repeat a scenario I routinely do in different circles to describe the inevitable destruction of the city of Miami by a Category 4 or 5 hurricane. I grew up there. I've been through lots of hurricanes, including hurricanes in Miami, and it's a deeply personal thing for me. The last time that a big storm actually hit Miami directly was in the 1920s. There weren't more than 100,000 people in Miami then, but 400, almost 400 of them died. That's 1/2 of 1% of the population. Now, the population of Miami is 6 million now, and that would mean by projection that 30,000 people would die immediately from such a storm. Back then, in the 1920s, people weren't as stupid as they are now, so they lived on the highest ground available, which sadly in Miami is 15 feet above sea level. The average elevation of Miami is 3 feet above sea level. Waves get higher than 3 feet. In spite of their caution, Miami Beach was completely underwater. Waves were breaking almost to Miami Airport, and it was a really, really bad thing. Nowadays, as I said, the population of Miami is somewhere around 6 million people, and people are living in the stupidest places you can possibly imagine. When I was a kid in Florida, it was illegal to build a house on the outer islands because everybody knew it was so dangerous, but Bibi Rebozo fixed that. And so now hundreds of thousands of people live 2 feet above sea level on those very beautiful islands. And so my scenario at the War College went something like this. The hurricane looms. People don't take it seriously enough until it's too late. Imagine those 2-lane causeways stretched for miles to get off of those islands. So 50,000 or more people just drown outright. Looting and mayhem occurs on the second day. Oops, thank you. Disease outbreaks on the third, cholera. That's what happens after about a third day of something like that. And then the Navy sends in the Marines to maintain order, shoot people if necessary, and conduct the evacuation of South Florida, which sounds really crazy, right? So I'm not a military person, and I got to tell you, it was daunting, and the glare of the brass buttons off the uniforms was blinding. But nobody blinked an eye when I did that. And the general consensus was that I was right, but it was probably a little bit worse. And oh, by the way, we have a plan for that. We are ready to respond to that storm when it happens because we know it's going to happen. Now, scenarios aside, And in a much more mundane way today, the Navy knows climate change is real because every one of its naval bases is drowning. And so they are going to have to move all the bases that are movable. Think Norfolk, that's about a $150 billion little job, and give up on the ones like Key West that will be completely underwater. And it's going to cost hundreds of billions or maybe even a couple of $1 trillion. The people of Louisiana also know that climate change is real because the coastline is disappearing at the rate of 1 football field every hour. And you know, this isn't models, these are just measurements. At the rate that Louisiana is drowning, the entire delta will be gone in a few decades, and the coastline will not be at New Orleans, but at Baton Rouge. That's 100 miles north of where the coastline is today. The state of Louisiana really tried to cover it up, but they're not trying to cover it up now. They are absolutely desperate. A lot of my book involved going there and looking at what was going on. And you know, the coastline is littered with churches like this, where the ocean level is about at the level of the top of the wood there. And of course, they're totally abandoned. Okay, and you know, Hurricane Harvey, Irma, Maria, Florence, Michael, 2017, 2018. That's an unprecedented 5 major hurricanes in a couple of years. That has never happened before in the history of the United States of America, by a factor of 3. All of those storms intensified. You know, people say the science isn't very good. A hurricane is a heat engine. We've been saying for decades that if the ocean gets warmer, the hurricanes will be stronger. Harvey, Maria, all of these storms, they hit pockets of very hot water, which is the new normal, and overnight they went from being tropical storms or Category 1 hurricanes to Category 4 or 5 hurricanes. You all know what happened. I mean, Michael literally erased the Florida Panhandle, including an entire US Air Force base. Maria killed thousands of Puerto Ricans, thousands of people. We don't even know where all the bodies are still today. Harvey and Florence drowned Houston and the Carolinas, and many of these people are still homeless and displaced. Hurricane Irma made a last-minute Hail Mary diversion when it bumped into Cuba slightly and spared Miami, but Miami's luck is bound to wear out. And it is classified by the United Nations, Miami is classified by the United Nations as the most vulnerable city in the world. Okay. So, and it's not just hurricanes and sea level rise. I'm not going to go on and on with all this stuff, but out west, people are really, and they should be, terrified of firestorms, which are extraordinary. And in the Southwest is running out of water. I could go on and on. But the point is that this is not something in the future. Americans today are already getting hammered by climate change. They're suffering terrible losses and sometimes dying, with a whole lot worse to come. And we say, oh no, it's not real. But for those people, it's more than real. And it's a hell of a lot worse in the developing world where they don't have the resources we have. And then most importantly, and I have to say the thing that really gives me hope is all those kids, right? The striking kids about climate change. They brought London to a standstill. They are rightly terrified because they know we have 10 or maybe on the outside 15 years to respond in a major way, or our children and our grandchildren are going to live in a 6 to 8 degree hotter world. And that's going to be hell. That's going to be living hell on Earth. So the urgent question for us here in a church this morning is, why hasn't the climate crisis registered on all of us the same way it has, say, when we pulled ourselves together at World War II? We went from being a peaceful, isolationist nation the day before Pearl Harbor to having 500 ships in the water a year later and doing the incredible things we did. So why aren't we taking this seriously in the same kind of way? Partly it's because of the incessant lies and literally billions of dollars of the propaganda that's being spewed at all of you every day, paid for by the oil industry and their sycophants, denying that the problem even exists. We scientists have also really badly screwed up because we've described the threats of climate change in ways that are abstract to normal people. the way the world's going to be 100 years from now when we're all going to be dead instead of what's going on right now. And partly our wealth and fortune, look around, lulls us into thinking we are immune. Not like all those other poor people, dare I say, brown-skinned countries who aren't as rich and powerful as we are. The President of the United States doesn't describe them in very generous terms. But most frighteningly, and what I think we all have to think about, is we seem to lack the necessary moral compass and will. We shrug our shoulders, we say it's hopeless, and there's nothing that we can do. And that's the easy and, I would say, deeply and profoundly shameful way out. It's the lazy way. It's an also unthinking death sentence. I'm not exaggerating. Death sentence to innumerable people on the planet, in addition to throwing away the prospects for our children's future. Now, we're gathered today in a church, and the role of religion, indeed the very definition of religion, is to bring people together as we are gathered here today. And in that sense, I would argue that we as a people, the American people, need a collective repentance. In the original biblical sense of repentance, to reevaluate our relations to each other and the world at large as we confront what is in effect a collective guilt in relation to the challenges of climate change. We are the world's worst offenders, and we know it. So what can we do? There's sort of two general things. One is we can get off our butts and we can push our governments to actually act, to actually think of what I'm talking about as the most important issue before us as we choose a president, rather than number 14 on the list. Some states are already doing it. I love the East Coast. I couldn't wait to get out of California, but it amazes me what California has been doing for decades and continues to do. They have been a leader for 30 years in fighting the government, the auto industry, and the oil industry in insisting on higher fuel standards for fuel efficiency standards for cars. And they do that to this day. The Republican mayor of San Diego, where I lived, where I first met Albert and Mile, is America's 10th largest city. The mayor of San Diego, a Republican, got together with the Democratic City Council to adopt extraordinarily stringent policies to reduce carbon emissions in all of San Diego. And these included massive investment in public transportation, green energy production, water conservation, tree planting, and everything. They're right on target. They've required themselves to do this by law. They're already producing a third of all their electricity from green energy sources. And when the mayor was asked, why did you do that? The Guardian newspaper is the greatest paper in the world for environmental news, the British paper. And the Guardian interviewed the mayor and asked him, well, why did you do this? And he said, I'm from San Diego. It's a beautiful place. I love where I live. He said, this is not a Republican issue. This is not a Democratic issue. This is an issue of what will San Diego be like when my kids are as old as I am. There was no question about what I ought to do, and I did it. And, that's a pretty extraordinary person. Most impressively, the entire state of California now legally requires that if you build a new house, you have to put solar panels on the roof. Otherwise, you can't build your house. It's just, that's the way it is. And the entire state is going to be green electricity by 2045. And they're more than a third of the way there. I mean, it's just the law in California. But it's not just California. Local communities, big local communities, like 1 million people, in ruby red Republican Texas are the national leaders in wind power for electricity production. Many of those communities, Georgetown, Texas is the leader, are virtually off the grid. They produce all their electricity from wind. And Oklahoma, Kansas, the Dakotas, Utah, and Idaho, you know how those places voted. But they are the national leaders and highly competitive on the world stage in wind power production of energy. And I don't sell them short. I think a lot of the people there are doing it because they really believe it's the right thing to do. But they're also doing it because it saves buckets and buckets of money. And it's just good business. And who doesn't like cleaner air, right? I mean, the air gets cleaner when you don't burn oil. New unsubsidized wind or solar power plants make electricity today more cheaply than new petroleum or coal-based fossil fuel electric plants, in spite of the fact that the green energy isn't subsidized. And do you know your tax dollars subsidize oil and gas production to an enormous extent? They really need your money, right? I mean, Exxon is broke. In spite of all that, a solar power plant in California makes electricity cheaper than an oil-powered power plant. In other words, converting to green energy production means that your electric bill would be smaller. The air you breathe would be cleaner. There'd be fewer cases of terrible allergies and lung disease, and people would statistically live longer. And if you don't believe that, it is a fact that the Clean Air Act over its 30-ish years has been calculated very, very conservatively to have saved trillions of dollars, and the lives of several 100,000 people every year have not died because of the Clean Air Act. I'm 76. I remember what New York City was like on a smoggy day, you know, in the afternoon in the late 1940s. It was disgusting. And the air in New York is pretty clean right now. It's this really energy production and investment in the United States would instantly change in a genuinely free market economy. We tout free market, but we are so far from a free market economy in terms of energy production. It's incredible. And isn't that ironic? I mean, if you think about politics today. Now, this is big government, you know, this is states and municipalities, but we will never, ever succeed unless we, you, me, as individual citizens, actually change the way we live. And you know, I do this 100 times a year or 50 times a year. It varies. I'm getting old. It's sort of harder to do so much. But people ask me all the time, what can I do? It's just me, you know? And the answer is there is an incredible amount of stuff that you can do. And not unscrewing a light bulb, but really big time stuff that you can do. So let's just talk about three of the most important ones, okay? The first one is we can start by buying nothing but all electric cars as soon as we need a new car, and stop whining about the inconvenience of a 200 or 300 mile range on a single charge. A range that encompasses virtually all the daily driving most of us do. You can drive to New York City and come back to here easily on an electric car. My Chevrolet Bolt is a cheap Spartan, but actually incredibly comfortable car. It gets 240 miles on an overnight charge in my garage. Now, heavy commuters might have to charge their cars several times a week. And if you want to make a wrong trip, it takes about 40 or 50 minutes to pull up to a rapid charge, then go have a cup of coffee and have your car be charged, which, by the way, costs less than $5. Yeah. So it's cheaper. And maintenance is nil. If you open up the trunk, the hood of my car, there's a little box, which is a computer. There's a container for windshield wiper fluid. There's the little motors for the windshield wipers. And there's two enormous electric engines on the two front wheels. And there's 1,000 pounds of batteries under the car that go from the front axle to the back axle. There is no maintenance. When I bought the car, I said, so what do I have to do? And they said, well, rotate the cars every year and fill the windshield wiper. That's it. And it doesn't make any noise, and it's instant power. Now, this is looking at the cars out there that you all drive. So you like luxury? Buy a Tesla. Teslas are so much cooler than the Mercedes and the BMWs out there. They are a blast to drive, a big Tesla. They're incredibly comfortable. They're fun. And there are going to be new 300 to 400 mile range SUVs in a year. I'm waiting because I live in Maine and I want an SUV. And I'm going to be able to buy one made by Ford that will go 400 miles on a single charge. And with that, I can go to Boston, screw around, and come back to Maine where I live all on a charge. The average American uses 500 gallons of gasoline every year. That is vastly more than Canadians and more than double the amount that Europeans consume. SUV owners use over 1,000 gallons of gasoline a year. Total United States gasoline consumption was 143 billion gallons in 2018. And it's an enormous percentage of all the greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. We could virtually eliminate all of that greenhouse emission within 10 years or less if we simply stopped driving gasoline-powered cars. That's all you would have to do. You could live in your mansions, you could do whatever you wanted, just change the kind of car that you drive. And if you think that's nuts, Norway is over 50% electric cars. And Norway's a pretty rough place to live. You know, it's rougher than where I live in Maine. It gets really cold. There's a hell of a lot of snow and ice. Electric cars don't work as well when it's 30 degrees below zero. But somehow Norwegians are perfectly happy with half of their cars being all electric. And they're going to start fining Norwegians for not buying electric cars soon. Volvo doesn't make all gasoline cars anymore because they know it's bad business. They know they'll go out of business if they don't adapt. Okay, so the second thing we can do is start putting solar power plants on our houses. Or if you don't like that because you think they're ugly, you can invest in a solar power plant. There's some beautiful places around here, fields that aren't full of horses, where you could have, 10,000 solar panels that would provide all the electricity for all around here. This is doable. It's being done all over places in the world. So I have solar panels. I have to admit, I only recently got around to it. They're all black. When people come down the driveway, they don't actually see them. They say, "Where are your solar panels?" Which I think is really sort of cool. And in Maine, these solar panels on, a sort of mid-sized house produce, on average, more electricity than I can possibly use in the year, including charging my car. So for me, I drive for free. Absolutely free. Okay, and then the third thing is, as Pope Francis emphasized, and I have to admit, when I first read the encyclical, I said, why did he put so much emphasis on consumerism? And then, when I thought about it, I thought, oh my God, he's really right. Think of all the unnecessary junk for sale in America. Go to a Walmart and just ask yourself how much of the stuff in the Walmart is actually useful for anything other than fulfilling a compulsive need to buy. Or ask yourself, why are we tearing down all sorts of beautiful, lovely homes like the lovely older homes around here, in many places to build 8 to 10 bedroom McMansions for families with 2 children. I mean, my wife grew up in Darien, Connecticut, and Darien, Connecticut is McMansionville today. And all those lovely, beautiful 1940s and 50s houses are being toppled to build these things. Steel, concrete, and construction are one of the major causes of carbon dioxide emissions. Do you remember the news only a few months ago? Somebody bought an apartment for $33 million in Manhattan on Central Park South. $33 million. That person might be in that apartment a few weeks out of the year. How much CO2 emissions were created for building that phallic structure in the sky, so that person could say, look at who I am and look at what I've got. Does anybody really need 3 homes or 4 homes or 5 homes? You can rent a villa and you can go any place you want. I mean, it's some sort of compulsive need. And on a smaller scale, like when you go home today, what about all that plastic? You know where plastic comes from, of course. It comes from petroleum, right? So it's another use of petroleum. And it's not really recyclable. And now that China says they don't want our garbage, it's really not recyclable. So even if you're a good, faithful recycler, in most communities in the United States, it's just being burned to make energy because we don't know what to do with it. You know, we used to buy lettuce and cucumbers we just pick them up, right? They'd be sitting there, and we might put them in a paper bag, or we just might put them in the cart and throw them in our shopping bag in the eat. But now we buy them in plastic boxes, big, hard, difficult to open plastic boxes. And you know, and you just say, well, why? Why is it in a box? For one thing, it's been in that box. Do you know how long it's been in that box? On average, it's been in that box for 1 to 2 weeks, breeding bacteria as it sits there. It doesn't taste as good as the stuff you pick up, wash off, and eat. And it's producing this vast, vast amount of waste. Whatever happened to glass bottles and glass juice bottles? I don't know about you, but I think Coca-Cola tastes one hell of a lot better out of a glass bottle instead of a plastic bottle. The reason we don't have them anymore is because the supermarkets didn't want to continue to recycle them. And in that regard, I lived for a year in Basel, Switzerland. Switzerland's a sort of strange place, and I felt claustrophobic at times and truly amazed at their brilliance and others. If you go to a supermarket in Basel and you forget to bring your shopping bag, you buy a tiny little flimsy plastic bag for $1. $1 just for that little bag. And if you bought a lot of food, you might spend $5 on flimsy plastic bags. After 1 or 2 mistakes, you remember to bring your little tiny bag that you can put in a purse or a briefcase that'll carry all your groceries. In Basel, if you want to buy a Coca-Cola, you pay 50 cents deposit for that. If you buy a crate of beer, you pay $20 just for the crate and 50 cents a bottle for each bottle of beer. That's $36 for a crate of beer. And, you know, and it's, in my experience, some of the richest people in the world are the stingiest. People bring I've seen the president of the Swiss Bank Corporation carrying his crate of empty beer bottles into the supermarket to get his $36 back. And then the most amazing thing of all is, you think you can just put your garbage in a bag? You can only put your garbage in an officially licensed Basler sack, which costs $2, and it's this big, $2 for this much garbage. If you don't put your garbage in one of those things, they put a gigantic day-glow orange ticket saying, "Das ist nicht gut." And you know, and then they're very conscious of shame in Switzerland, so this is like the black spot or the scarlet letter. I mean, you don't do that anymore. If they can do it, why can't we? Basel is incredibly clean. And a big part of it is just this common sense of doing it. So do an experiment when you go home. Empty out your recycling container. I assume you carefully wash all your recycling before you put it in a container. Empty it out and put it on a table. And ask yourself, why is each object there? And I think you'll discover that the majority of those objects really weren't necessary. You didn't have to buy the lettuce in that plastic box. You didn't have to do this. You didn't have to do that. There'll be stuff, right? There will be stuff, and all the rest of it. And you can have all the paper you want because that's really recyclable. You can have all the glass you want. That's really recyclable if it's no deposit. But just do that. And it's I teach little kids in Maine about the environment, and I'll tell you, you do that with little kids, and they go, "Oh my God, why did my mommy buy that?" And then they go home. It's sort of like when we all had to have seat belts, and our kids started saying, "Put on your goddamn seatbelt," right? and they're the ones that made it do it. Okay, so let's conclude by asking, what does it mean not to do what I'm talking about? Okay? It means that the Earth will get a little bit warmer, a little bit faster. Actually, in the case of our automobiles, it will get a whole lot warmer, a whole lot faster if we don't switch to electric cars. Air pollution will be worse, progressively worse and worse. More people will unnecessarily suffer from allergies, and more will die of air pollution-related diseases here in the US and abroad. And remember what I said about the Clean Air Act. It was one of the most magnificent, that was Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act. That was because Russell Train, a lifelong Republican, convinced the president that this was the moral and ethical and healthy thing to do. And it was a revolution in American public health and well-being. But if we just keep doing this, all of that is going to be erased. How many people are going to die of that? It's unnecessary. And how do we go to sleep at night? Thinking about that. In China, how many of you, I don't want to show of hands, but I'll bet you a lot of you have been to China. Most recently, I was in Xi'an, where the amazing terracotta warriors were, and the air pollution alert was 360. I wore a gas mask. I looked like something, you know, in the Alien, which maybe I do anyway, but it was really awful. China admits, in fact, they broadcast that about 1.5 million people die unnecessarily from air pollution in China every year. They are desperately trying to fix this. And I want to say that they lead the world in solar power production and wind production and all the rest of it, because they know that their government will topple if they can't clean things up. Sea level will rise a little bit faster if we don't change our ways. New York City will be even more vulnerable to another Hurricane Sandy. Sea level has risen this much, and we haven't done anything to fix it. What's really crazy about that is for about $35 or $40 billion, we could build a battery to buy lower in another 50 or 100 years. But de Blasio and Cuomo don't like each other, and so, you know, it doesn't happen. Louisiana will drown faster. Katrina produced 500,000 climate refugees, most of them African American, who have had the intelligence not to return. The resurgence of population in New Orleans is not from the original inhabitants, but young kids lured by the good jobs in the computer and tech industry. Those people eventually settled. How many more climate refugees will be created by another Katrina in Louisiana or elsewhere? And where will those people go? I mean, if that horrible thing I described happens in Miami, that's 6 million climate refugees. Maybe it'll be possible to go back, maybe it won't, but for a long time, 6 million people. These people are going to be desperate. For retirees, practically everything they own is the house and the land, which will be underwater. They're going to need charity. Who's going to give them that charity? Who's going to give 5 million Americans charity? What's that going to do to our economy? I mean, it's staggering. That's something they talk about, by the way, all the time in the Naval War College. I mean, this is, and the CI, this is serious stuff. 50 million people in Bangladesh are already moving because their land is going underwater. And if we don't do anything, 20 or thereabouts, entire island nations will drown under the sea within 20 or 30 years. Countries in the Indian Ocean are buying land in Australia to move to be their country because it's going. And then, you know, you think we have an immigration crisis? Central America is baking. If we don't do something about climate change, we will have a mass horde descending on the southern border that makes what's going on right now look like a picnic. I'm talking about millions of people, and there's not a wall in the world that will keep those millions of people out. This is a vastly important issue for our national security. Now, like all of you, you know, I tend to be overwhelmed by my daily life. I worry about my son's job. I think about my daughter moving, you know, and just getting married. I mean, all those things that consume our lives, my granddaughters. I mean, I don't know what happened to kids, but it seems like they're booked from 7 o'clock in the morning to 7 o'clock at night, and whichever parent is responsible tears their hair. I mean, that's modern America. But in spite of all that, in spite of my life being just like yours, I actually think about climate change every day. I think about it not because I'm some sort of pathological neurotic. I think about it because I know that everything I value and everything that I've worked for my entire life could be thrown in the garbage can if we don't do something about climate change in 10 or 15 years. Because the world I love and the order and the peace and the quiet that I have will be reduced to chaos. Like it or not, you, we, all of us, are on the verge of a profound social and economic revolution. There is no escape. No escape. Because what goes on in these other places affects you here. It affects you in terms of the strength of our government and all the rest. So given this inevitability, and in the spirit of Tikkun Olam, I prefer, personally, to think about the challenges ahead as positive things that we can do instead of onerous damnations that, oh my God, I'm going to have to give up this, that, and the other. These are great opportunities. They're great.